Zaki Hassan as your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Welcome back to Nostalgia Theater. I'm your host, Zaki Hassan, and when it comes to Star Trek anniversaries, this year is an important one, marking 25 years not only since the Next Generation crew wrapped up their record-breaking run with the feature-length finale All Good Things, but also since they made their cinematic debut in Star Trek Generations. That film brought us our one and only on-screen pairing of Captains Kirk and Picard, and here to talk about the Enterprise D's journey to the big screen is the man who was there for both the end of the show and the beginning of the movies, writer Ronald D. In addition to his 64 Star Trek credits spanning TNG, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. He's also the man behind the 2003 Battlestar Galactica reboot, rightly praised as one of the most important sci-fi series of all time, and his current series is Outlander, airing on Starz. Ron, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
So, before we even get into it, I just want to say this is just a real thrill for me because I remember being in 8th grade and riding the school bus to my junior high and reading the Next Generation Companion, and I felt like I knew you all the way back then. So the fact that I get to actually chat with you is just kind of cool.
No, thank you. That's very kind.
So now your story of how you joined the staff of The Next Generation is already pretty legendary, and I don't want to recap that here because people can't find it. But to boil it down, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of you were the fan who made good. You were just you somehow you found a way to get your script in front of the right people. Michael Piller had changed the writer submission rules, and as a result, you joined the writing staff in like 1990. Do I have the date right?
89.
89. Okay, so 5 years later, you go from guy who loves watching Star Trek to guy who is writing the Star Trek movies. What was that like?
It was pretty amazing. I mean, the whole experience there was like, it was literally childhood fantasy comes true, because I grew up with Star Trek in the 70s when it was in syndication, and watched it after school when I came home 5 days a week, and I just became obsessed with it and loved it. And then when I went to college, I went to my first Star Trek convention, and I was a fan. And so to get on the show was like a huge thing, and to be on the show for those years, and to be able to literally be able to walk down to the bridge of the Enterprise and sit in the captain's chair anytime I felt like it was, an amazing thing. And then it was, just honor on top of honor when Brandon and I were asked to write the finale of the show, which we didn't expect to, because we thought everyone assumed that Michael Piller was going to write it himself, and he declined and asked us to do it. And then to do the movie was, like, oh my God, we're doing this too. It was really something.
So you essentially get these assignments end to end. Did the movie come first? Did the finale come first?
Movie came first.
Okay.
Rick Berman called us over and said he had been asked to produce a movie, and he wanted us to write it, and that was like a year out. So we had worked on Generations for almost a calendar year before we got the assignment to do All Good Things. So there was a period of crossover where we were working on both projects simultaneously, which was a little bit much even for us, because you were working on two 2-hour pieces with the exact same group of characters simultaneously. And there were definitely days where we would be working together and we would just get confused on which show we were on. We'd be in some engine room having tech arguments and stuff about warp drives and phasers, and then we would kind of stop and go, but wait a minute, which one is this?
So when it came to Generations, my understanding is there was also a script by Maurice Hurley that was in contention. Am I misremembering that?
No, that's true. They had commissioned 2 scripts, one by us and one by Maury, and then Rick and Paramount would pick between them. I never saw Maury's script, so I don't.
Okay.
I don't even really know what it was.
So I'm assuming the only connective thread between your script and his was that there would be some crossover.
I'm not entirely positive. I mean, it's been a while, and like I said, I never read it, and I think it was described to me at one point, but I'm sure there are other sources that could tell you definitively what was in Maury's script and what wasn't. I'm not sure if there was a crossover with the original cast.
Interesting. Okay. So for you guys, now you've said this before, that when you came on, there was an effort on Next Generation to keep the original crew at arm's length, and that as your tenure progressed, that the wall started to fall a little bit. Yeah,
I mean, you couldn't even mention the original crew in dialogue. When I first started, they were very sensitive about it. But I was the fan among the pros, and I was always looking for little ways to sneak in references that probably nobody would get except me and the real fans out there. So I would reference planets or other starships, or I remember when I wrote Data's Day, the wedding ceremony that Picard gives between Keiko and Chief O'Brien, I cribbed it pretty much word for word from the wedding ceremony in Balance of Terror, which got all the way to the stage before somebody sniffed it out. And I got called carpet. They were like, "Did you take this from the original series?" I was like, "Yeah, I did." And they were like, "You got to clear that stuff beforehand." And they were really upset. But they didn't change it. It just kind of went through. And I just sort of shrugged and smiled to myself. I was like, "Ooh, I won that one."
So was that a Gene Roddenberry thing, or was that a Rick Berman thing?
I think it was more of a Rick thing.
Okay.
They were still, I was there at the start of third season. It was still very much growing pains of the show. And the biggest question of the show was really, how different are we from the original, and how similar are we from the original? And in the first season, they had already literally remade, The Naked Time. And so they'd gone all the way to that, and had McCoy in the show, and then I think they pulled all the way back to the other side and convinced themselves that the early attempts to tie themselves in continuity to the original series were a mistake, and then they wanted to stay as far away from it as possible, and it became kind of just a rule without a lot of thought to it, and then the walls just kind of broke down gradually over time.
So by the time it comes to do the movie, what guidelines are you given, if any? I mean, what are you essentially told it has to be this?
It was kind of a laundry list of things. I mean, there was, they said, we want to do a crossover between the two crews, but the original series crew can only be in the first 15 minutes. You can have Kirk in both, but no one else. There has to be a Picard story is dominant. There has to be a Data comic relief story. We want some Klingons in it, and we want a big villain like Khan to be in it, and don't do time travel, but find a way to reunite the crews. Go. It's like, okay. And it was, so the movie is constructed within those parameters. It was difficult to try to get all those things to work together in some coherent fashion. So we spent months just trying to figure out how to do that.
And I mean, how do you feel that it came together? I mean, you've in the past said that you kind of wish it had turned out better. I mean, how do you, with 25 years of hindsight, do you feel like you stuck the landing with a lot of those things that you were the laundry list, as you said?
No, I mean, I think ultimately it's a flawed film. I think it's, as I said before, I think our reach, was greater than our grasp. We weren't really able to land the big themes of the piece, which were mortality and sort of dealing with your mortality as the ship dies, Picard's dealing with his own personal mortality and the death of Kirk. They were just too big of themes for us to tackle and also try to make it this fun, rollicking action-adventure film. And those elements never really gelled together. I do think that there's a lot of good moments in it. There's some charming scene work. There's some of the characters pop through really well. The crash of the saucer section is pretty spectacular in the pre-CGI era. The sound is amazing, great score, some good stuff in it. I don't think it's a terrible movie. I just think it's not really as good as we wanted it to be, and it's just kind of a failed effort in a lot of ways.
It's interesting because I acknowledge everything you say, and yet, for me, I remember the experience of watching it and being excited to see the Next Generation on the screen for the first time, and so I can never separate that, And so, like you say, like and I'll tell you something. I remember being in the car driving home. I was 14, and I had just watched Captain Kirk die, and just completely unbidden, I started to cry.
Oh, great.
And that's the first time I can remember crying over a character.
Yeah. I don't think the fact that I see flaws in it as one of the writers should take away that experience from people.
Yeah.
Because it's a similar thing. I remember when I saw Star Trek: The Motion Picture for the first time, and it was a huge moment in Star Trek fandom. I was it was '79, so I was like a freshman in high school in Go in the big theater, and this was the moment. Throughout the whole '70s, basically my whole childhood, this was the dead show that suddenly where finally was being brought back to life. And I loved it, and I enjoyed it, and I was moved. I remember when Kirk takes that big, long tour of the Enterprise and Space Dock, I was moved to tears. And the whole thing, I walked out with a huge smile on my face. And now, down through the years, I can acknowledge all the flaws of that film, too. It's like, how many sequences of them staring at the view screen can you really tolerate? But there was something about the movie and the moment that was really special and really perfect. And it worked in that time, in that place, because it meant so much to all of us who had wanted it to happen. And I can totally see how Generations speaks to people about that moment and people who saw it for the first time then.
It's, it really was peak Star Trek, that moment, like you said. I had Brandon on the show a couple of years ago, and he said the same thing. I mean, you had the Time magazine cover.
Yeah.
I think it was The Passion That Drives the Enterprise. It had Kirk and Picard, and it's weird to think now because certainly for me at the time, again, I'm like high school, and that was the time when you don't admit you like Star Trek. Like, oh, I want girls to talk to me. I'm not going to admit I like Star. Now it's like I don't care. But there was a validation that came with that Time magazine cover.
Yeah. That we had been waiting for in fandom for a very long time, because I think that was part of what fueled us as fans, was that sense of being, not taken seriously, being canceled after 3 seasons, being that stupid show that only the nerdy geek kids watch, and oh my God, Star Trek, and they're such idiots, and they're conventions and they dress up and all this stuff, and the sort of desire for mainstream acceptability was really something that I think all of us in the 70s in particular, but probably into the 80s, felt was like an important thing, and that we weren't getting. And you kept feeling like, Star Wars gets all the press and they get all this, but our show is superior and smarter, and it's about deeper things, and and so there was always this kind of like chip on your shoulder about being a Star Trek fan in those days. And when you finally get to the top of the mountain and you get the Time magazine cover and the multiple movies and all the TV series, you kind of look around and go, it was actually more fun trying to get up the mountain up here on top.
Well, I mean, let's talk about killing off Captain Kirk, because that's what this movie is known for, and that was not a stipulation that you were presented with.
No, it was. I think I would probably be the prime mover behind that. I was really interested in the idea of writing the final chapter of Kirk's life. There was something as a writer, especially as a young writer, you're drawn to death scenes. You're drawn to what's the end of something, in the same way you're drawn to what's the beginning of something. And the death of one of the great heroes was really appealing on just a literary, angle. And so I was really intrigued with that. And there was obviously deeper personal things for me that I don't even really understand. Kirk was my personal hero as a child growing up. It was who I consciously wanted to emulate myself on for many, many years. And, was just this big figure in my life. And I wanted to write his final chapter and kill him somehow. I was very driven towards that. And it seemed like it matched into everything else that we were trying to do in the movie, because it was about passing the torch from one generation to another. We had decided we were going to destroy the Enterprise. it all just kind of felt of a piece, all these deaths and all these things. And to kill the big hero at the end of it felt like that was like the proper a proper element to go into that film.
Now, but that being said, you had to do it twice.
Yeah, the first one, there was a test screening of the original cut that didn't test well, frankly. And Sherry Lansing, who was head of Paramount Pictures at the time, we all gathered in her office after the test screening, and she said, well, you have a great movie with a bad ending. And I was like, oh. It was kind of clear. That was even before the cards came back in the room, and people were like scanning through the comments that people had said. And so it was a pretty clear consensus right off the bat that the death scene didn't work. It just didn't come off the way we'd anticipated. What we were going for was sort of like end of Sands of Iwo Jima. John Wayne's there with his buddies, and he's shot off from an off-camera sniper, I think in the back. And it was the irony of him, the big hero in the piece that, is killed, in this dastardly way. But like his heroism was transcended all that. And there was something ironic about it. And we didn't want it to be him dying on the bridge of a starship blowing up, because it just all felt, every other version we went down felt so cliche. And it felt like this would be sort of a shocking, more emotional way to go. And you saw it on screen and it just didn't work. So then go back and reshoot it and try to give it a little bit more spectacle, a little bit more pop to it. But truth was, they didn't give us nearly enough money to do a much bigger redo. And you had to go back to the same location. It had to be done in a very short time period. Excuse after excuse after excuse. This was the best we could do given the parameters that we had.
You sort of, this is the set that you have, and this is what's available. So it's like, work with that.
Yeah, it was. I mean, Brandon and I, we spitballed various other concepts that involved underground chambers or other laboratories or, ways to get off the mountain and go have a bigger character conversations. And the answer was just always no. We can't build a new set. No. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough money. The only thing we can do is go back to that location, and it has to be, fit within these few minutes of the film. You can't have big, longer scenes. It was basically just give us a better stunt. Was really what it kind of came down to.
It's funny because nearly 20 years later, I'm in the theater watching The Force Awakens, and there's Han Solo stepping out on that catwalk, and my heart starts racing because I kind of have a sense of what's about to happen.
Oh, no.
And I think part of that is just PTSD because of you guys putting Captain Kirk on the catwalk, 19 years earlier. And I'm like, whenever my heroes step on a thing here, it doesn't end well.
Yeah.
But I mean, with that in mind, you guys were ahead of the curve when it comes to that idea of these heroes that are immortal can end. And in terms of cinema, that was at a time when, James Bond would end and we would just, Roger Moore would lead way to Timothy Dalton, etc. Now it seems like we're at this point where we're seeing that. Now Iron Man can get killed off, for goodness sake, so in that sense, you were way ahead of the curve. And I'm curious now, with 25 years of hindsight, were you to do it again, would you not have Kirk die, or would you have Kirk die a different way?
I think I would have just had him die a different way. I think it was the right choice. I think it was, you wanted to end that saga to really hand off to the next saga. And I think there's once you kind of tell the audience that the characters literally are immortal, they will never die, you take away a huge amount of jeopardy and attention to everything that they do, right? I think that, the seminal event in the Star Trek movies is really the death of Spock. That was an enormous thing. I cried. It's like everybody was like, bereft when that happened. And then they brought him back in the very next film. And there is a sense, even though I like the subsequent films of the original cast, to varying degrees, depending on which one, and they're all great, fun movies, it did just kind of take something fundamental away from it. The jeopardy was gone. You knew that all these guys were going to be safe. And the film that works the best of the post-Wrath of Khan films is Voyage Home, because they're not trying to tell you any of these guys are going to die. It's life. It's just sit back and enjoy it. None of these guys are gonna buy it. And when you get into them really trying to be scared or really trying to have jeopardy, Undiscovered Country is not a bad film in a lot of ways, but you never really think Kirk is going down. He's never really going to die. He's never really going to spend the rest of his life on that prison planet. It's because you've basically been down this road. Once you've gone through the Spock, death and resurrection, okay, then none of them are going to die. And it just takes something away. And I think if Kirk, by killing Kirk, if we had done it a little more impact, the death of one of the great heroes, it just would have made him mortal in a real sense, and mortals all die and pass away, and that was part of why we wanted to do it. And it just kind of meant that the whole Star Trek franchise would have had a certain freedom of like, yeah, sometimes they kill a character and he really stays dead, and it makes you care a lot. I mean, it's an odd analogy, but I'm thinking Game of Thrones really wrote the book on that. You kill people and you make it real, everything's suddenly heightened. Everything is greater tension. You worry about all the people that you love because anything could happen to them in any moment. And the audience really leans forward.
See, and I think what you say is profound, especially when it comes to Star Trek, because that moment really signified the idea that Star Trek is the universe and not necessarily the people in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Again, I watch Star Trek now with my kids, right? And so and actually, as it happens, we just watched All Good Things last week, just by chance, because we're going through it sort of chronologically. And, their experience with this franchise is very different from, me growing up. It was, Star Trek is these people. And then these new people came in and I was like, wait a minute, hold on. And then, I had to grow to love them. But for subsequent generations, that's never been the case. But it's when we talk about Captain Kirk, obviously he is such an outsized presence that even, now without William Shatner, we still have to go back to that, that paradigm. But getting Shatner on board, now you've told the story, but I'm curious, was he really amenable as easily as you've said in the past?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really. He didn't flinch at it. I didn't have the first direct conversations with him. Rick Berman did, and Rick said that he's open to it. He just wants it to be good, and that was kind of his attitude throughout. He didn't object. We had the one story meeting that I've talked about with me, Brandon, Rick, and Bill, and he just wanted to make sure that Kirk was important, and that he was integral to the plot. He never questioned the death. He never said in that meeting, I'm having second thoughts, or I don't know why we're going to do this, or I don't want to. He never, and everyone kind of was waiting for that moment. Everyone was kind of waiting for him to have second thoughts all the way through shooting. It was like, I wonder how Bill's going to feel. I wonder if he's going to come back to us later and say, hey, I know, could we shoot this other scene that maybe would be insert where he lived? Or, he never did that. He never second-guessed it. He never tried to go back on it. He just, right from the beginning, I think he was a little hesitant, like, am I ready? But he never really said, let's not do it.
Yeah, in his book, in Star Trek Movie Memories, his description of sort of his own coming to terms with it, I found it very profound. Having to say good. That being said, if William Shatner's meeting one, he's like, I'll do it, but you can't kill me off. Would he not have been killed off?
Oh, sure. I would have tried to argue him into it. I think with Brandon and I were pretty much passionate that this was the right thing to do, but the reality was they didn't want to do it. That was it. It wasn't going to happen.
Yeah,
and the movie was going to be made. There was going to be a Generations film, if Shatner didn't like that part of it and didn't want to do it, that part would have been lost, and we would have still made the movie.
Well, I mean, with that in mind, obviously William Shatner was essential. The rest of the original crew was less essential than Captain Kirk being part of it. I mean, can you talk about the original formulation that you constructed, where more of the original crew would have been in it?
Yeah, we had them all. We had the whole original cast in the opening moves. Same concept. They were. I'm trying to think. I think it was still the Enterprise C, and I think they came aboard. It was like a reunion of putting the gang back together. It was the Starfleet Felicity kind of thing. It was like, oh, we're commissioning a new Enterprise. Let's get the old gang back together and gather them up from all the different places that they are for this PR event. And they all kind of showed up, various grumbles and various like eye rolling, but then they kind of were there together again. And it was kind of fun for a minute until it all went sideways. And there's a lot of characters. We still had the mandate that they couldn't be in the film very much. It was like, I think it was first 15 or 20 minutes tops. And so we were trying desperately to give everybody a little moment, within that. But then when you had to add in the crisis and the explosion and Kirk getting pulled into the Nexus and all that, by the time the draft got down to the 20-page version, each of them had like a line or two. And when that was the script that we kind of passed around to see their interest, and they all kind of looked at it and went, well, I've only got a line or two. So most of them passed.
Yeah.
Then Scotty and Chekhov, we decided, well, let's go after them and we'll just pare everything down and try to give them more. So at least they've got more than one or two lines. We'll try to give them a little run or a little character thing for each of them, to sort of make it more palatable and make it more fun.
So was that a situation where it was Spock and McCoy originally, and then they bowed out? So it's like, let's see who we can work with. Was it? Because it feels to me when I watch that sounds like a McCoy line, or that sounds like a Spock line, or am I just?
I think the roots of I'd have to really go back and look, but I'm pretty sure the roots of a lot of their dialogue and the interaction was rooted in the Spock, McCoy, Kirk sort of trio.
Yeah. It's interesting because as I was prepping to talk to you, I went into my storage and I was digging through old Sci-Fi Universe magazine. You remember that, right? For the Mark Altman's, and I was reading the stuff, about the wrap up of the show in the beginning of the movie, and I was sort of surprised by how George Takei was he was taking a 2x4 to the whole concept of the movie, and I was like, man, clearly a lot of these guys have their strong contentions about the roles that these characters should play. That's rough. I mean, it's hard to deal with, I'm sure.
It goes with the territory. By that point in time, I'd spent 5 years dealing with actors and whether what their feelings were on various scenes or episodes, and they're the ones who have to play it, and so they're kind of entitled to their opinion, and they're entitled to their feelings about it because they're the ones whose faces go in front of millions, and they're the ones who have to inhabit and embody the character, and you just learn to roll with it. It's like, the actor didn't like that, and if they're sometimes their opinions are valid or their thoughts are valid creatively about what you should or shouldn't do, and other times you just kind of shrug and go, well, we're just going to agree to disagree here.
Yeah, right. So for you personally, now the Next Generation ends, and the movie notwithstanding, you jump over to Deep Space. Yeah. And so deep. This is right. So your experience on Deep Space is something that I feel like I felt like I got to know intimately just by virtue of the Deep Space Nine companion book by Terry Erdman, which is like next level. That book is amazing.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And so for me, when that show ended, it's funny because it's going to sound cliche now, but like I remember when that show ended, and I felt very lonely out there being like, this is the one. This is going to be the one people are talking about, eventually. And then now here we are 20 years later. And finally, with the documentary and things like that, people are realizing it was a really special show.
It really was.
I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like that show and the particular working environment they had, they really allowed you to flower.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was next level writing for me. I think of Next Gen as sort of undergraduate school, and then I went to graduate school at Deep Space. I had more experience. I was higher up on the hierarchy. I was producing more, and Ira Bear just dug far deeper into character and really wanted to push the boundaries of what Star Trek was and what it could be in every conceivable way. So it was really a challenging, fun environment where we were always trying to do something different. We were always trying to, go better go farther, go higher. We were always just pushing to see what we could do. How flexible was the format? How flexible were the characters? What if we told the story this way? What if we do the big serialized tale with the Dominion that everyone is telling us not to do? What if we start that sneaky and we build it in bit by bit until they can't stop us anymore? It was great. It was an amazing thing, and we just really dug into the characters. We really, I learned a tremendous amount about writing, about story structure, producing, everything that I thought I knew at Next Gen. I realized there were deeper and more profound levels to go to at Deep Space Nine, and it was just an amazing experience.
Yeah, I just this past week I watched the episode The Maquis, the two-parter, and Sisko has that line. He says it's easy to be a saint in paradise.
Yeah,
and
that kind of defined. That was a pivotal line in the ethos of the Star Trek universe, because up until that point, the mandate really was the Federation and Earth are a paradise. Don't mess with them. And all the Starfleet people are relatively perfect. They all are, these evolved new humans, and they don't have the same petty grievances, and they won't act in certain ways. And Deep Space had been bit by bit taking that apart and trying to make our characters more human and more relatable and more complicated. And that line of Sisko was a way of to just kind of saying, okay, you can have your cake and eat it too. If you want to think of Earth as a paradise and the Federation is perfect, go ahead. But it's easy to think that back there. But out here on the frontier, things are a little messier. And that gave us sort of license to then go further and to really play with our characters more, because they weren't living in paradise. They were living on the bloody and uncomfortable frontier.
And yet, I mean, to me, what sticks out is that the show is Star Trek to its core. I mean, it is fundamentally about preserving those ideals. It's about pushing up against a wall and saying, what are we fighting for? What is worth fighting for?
That was very important to us. We weren't out to destroy Star Trek. People accused us of that. Rick would accuse us of that. The studio would worry about that we were the barbarians at the gates trying to destroy this franchise. And we felt very much the opposite. We loved Star Trek. We wanted it to be better. We wanted to see how far it could go. We were afraid of it calcifying and becoming, irrelevant and something that wasn't fun or interesting anymore. And that was watching television pass it by. And we wanted to make it a better show. And that was, but we loved Star Trek, and we didn't want to destroy it. We wanted to save it.
And the narrative is that you guys were kind of doing your thing while the hall monitors had their back turned. I mean, is that accurate?
We certainly felt that way. I mean, that was our in the bunker of the writers' room. Our sense was, everyone's attention is on Voyager and on the movies, and Enterprise is coming down the road too. That we kind of felt like we're not getting the promotion, we're not getting the big budgets. They've written us off, and nobody cares. And hey, fine, don't care about us. Please don't care about us, so we can do what we want, and we'll just keep, doing our own thing here. And that again, going back to what I said earlier, we had a chip on our shoulder, and that chip on our shoulder goaded us to do better work and to sort of have the attitude of, well, you know what? We're going to prove how wrong you were. You may not love us now, but they're going to love us later, and that day will come. And that was our attitude.
And it's got to feel nice to know that to a large extent, the conventional wisdom is that Deep Space is the best of the modern Star Trek shows. I mean, that's got to feel pretty nice.
It is very nice.
I got to tell you, I was in the audience watching the documentary 2 weeks ago, and it was, first of all, it was packed. There was not a single seat open. Yeah. And it was like being in a room full of people who are all in on the joke.
Yeah.
They were laughing at all the little stuff that, and I was like, this is the niche inside of a niche. Star Trek itself is this niche thing, and it's like this is the little crevice inside of that all the cool kids are really talking about.
Yeah, I still haven't seen it. It's like I wasn't able to go to the screening that they held for people that were in it, and then I just haven't been able to see it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it.
I was talking about it on my other show. I was raving about it, and I was like, there's no better metaphor for Deep Space Nine in terms of its perception within the franchise that Ira Behr had to crowdfund to get this documentary made, as opposed to CBS being like, oh, here's a thing to promote our thing.
Yeah.
It's
I know.
like, oh,
Crazy.
You're promoting our property? Yeah, by all means. No, we have to raise money for it. I'm like, that's Deep Space Nine in a nutshell.
It kind of goes back to the roots of Star Trek and the original, the letter writing campaigns to NBC to save the show in the 60s and all that,
Well, I mean, with that in mind, and this might be a loaded question, do you feel like Deep Space Nine is more the heir to the spirit of the original show?
Hard to say. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it was in terms of the shows that I worked on. I think that, Next Gen's a special show too, and they're hard to kind of compare and contrast the two of them, because Next Gen is taking the original series concept of the starship boldly going, and trying to update it and trying to make it a more interesting, a more thoughtful show. Less kind of de-emphasizes the action adventure component of it, dials up the sort of thoughtful, ethical dilemmas of it. Sometimes gets too techy. Has a more diverse group of characters generally, and is more of an ensemble than it really was in the original, which was really Kirk, Spock, and McCoy over and over again.
Yeah.
But it never quite had the same spirit of fun and adventure that the original did, and the characters had been toned down where they really didn't have a lot of conflicts between. There's nothing like those epic, great fights of Spock, McCoy, and Kirk that they went at it, in various combinations. In the original, that was really some of the greatest stuff of that show. We really weren't able to do that. You didn't really have that stuff in Next Gen. And in Deep Space, we did. In Deep Space, you could really have the characters go at each other, be unhappy with each other, betray each other, hurt each other, make up, have relationships. It was a richer sort of character piece, and in that way, it was more of an inheritor to the original series, and certainly it was a bigger kind of construct that talked about humanity and talked about people in a day-to-day way, in an episode by episode way, more so than the Next Generation did.
Yeah, when talking about Next Generation, I've heard the phrase comfort food, and I almost feel like that's diminutive. But the phrase I've used is, I call it competence porn. And what I mean by that is you watch it just to watch these people who are competent, they like each other, they get along, and the problem will be solved by the end. And you watch it, and that feels good. Yeah. And to me,
I think that's a quality to that show that I may not have valued as much at the time, and that it's taken me a long time to kind of realize that was a big draw in it. Because when I was on the show, I was writing it, but I was also frustrated by the limitations. Oh, why can't I have Riker really be pissed? Why can't I have Riker hard really go at it, or Troy, or have Beverly just do something horrendous or whatever. I was always looking to rough up the characters and try them do things, or have somebody just flat out fail, and I just couldn't do it. I always got frustrated by that. But then, as years have gone by, I've heard what you just said many, many times. I remember we had regathered the writers' room for, I think it was like a Blu-ray release, and Seth MacFarlane was he was moderating the panel of all of a group of the Star Trek writers together. And Seth said almost exactly what you're saying, that he liked the fact that they liked each other, they were good people, and they were competent at their jobs, and there was something positive and there was something uplifting about that as a week-to-week television show. And sort of something that I was doing it in the throes of it, and I was frustrated by limitations, but looking back at it now and coming around to the realization that what we did do was something else. It's aspirational, it's hopeful, it makes people feel good, and there's value in that. It doesn't have to be rough character edges on everything. Not everything has to be Battlestar Galactica.
Sure.
That's one flavor, but it doesn't have to be every flavor. And Next Generation had a different flavor, and people really responded to it, and I did too. It's just that I got so caught up in focusing on what the limitations of the format were that I think sometimes I didn't appreciate, what we did have and the richness of what we were able to do successfully, time after time.
And certainly the ultimate measure of the impact it made on Seth MacFarlane is plain to see in the Orville, which is just, it's a weekly Valentine to specifically Next Generation.
Yeah, it's spooky. I haven't watched a lot of it, but I watched a couple of episodes of the first season, and I was like, this is like the show that's going on next door, The Next Generation.
That show snuck up on me, I got to be honest, because the pilot, I wasn't sure what to make of it, and then, maybe a third of the way through the first season, I was like, oh, they're doing good stuff here,
Yeah, they mean it. It's like, because the promos, Fox, of course, promoted it like it was Family Guy or something. And that's kind of what you expect, and then you've got to go, wait, that's not really what they're doing here.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, with that in mind, when we look at where the franchise is at now, I'm curious. I mean, have you had a chance to check out any of the recent stuff?
Not really. I mean, I watched I watched most of the first season, but I just haven't so much TV, and I just haven't caught up on especially second season and all that. I mean, it certainly looks amazing and great cast and interesting. It's such a different format now to have a continuing story, to have big serialized tales in the Star Trek universe. That alone is sort of takes a while to even wrap your brain around, because that's just not what it was about for 40 years.
Yeah, and I mean, just as I was looking at you've got 60 plus credits, which is, I mean, that's an astonishing number, and I was thinking, does the TV landscape now allow for somebody to amass that many Star Trek credits anymore? I don't know, because we got that was when you were looking at 26 episode seasons, and now I don't know how long Discovery is, like 13 or 15, I don't know. It's a different world.
Yeah. It's a very different world. 64 is almost a full run of a series now.
That's amazing. I mean, when you look at that, and for me, I the fact that you have this amazing volume of work that you amassed in Star Trek, and yet it is just one chapter of your career. Obviously, Battlestar and everything else. What did you carry forward from Star Trek? From not from your time as a Star Trek fan, but from your time as a Star Trek writer.
I think the big thing was the spirit of the writers' room. I got lucky when I started that third season writers' room with Ira Behr and Hans Beimler and Richard Manning and Melinda Snodgrass. They just kind of taught me the value of that group of people and how you want them to be. The camaraderie in a writer's room, the freedom of a writer's room, the ability to sit and pitch ideas and not feel stupid if your idea is stupid, and to everyone really being in the game together, and a sense of also there's us and then there's them. And them was everyone outside the writer's room. The producers, the actors, the set, the studio, everybody was them. And there was us. And we're the people who are trying to make the show work. And we're trying to make the best show we can over and over and over again. And yes, all those people outside the room are trying to do the same thing, but we're special in here. And there's a special group, and we go to lunch, and we laugh together, and we cry together, and we're able to yell at each other passionately and angrily, and then, just like the Roadrunner and the Sheepdog, to punch out and go and have lunch and laugh, and then come back and punch the clock and yell again, And I really valued that, and I took that, Deep Space Nine was even more so that way. And so my experience of Star Trek overall was I always wanted writers' rooms like that. And I had them, and then sometimes I didn't have them. You're always looking for that special chemistry of putting writers in a room that can trust each other and do great work like that. Because basically you're in a room with other people for hours every day, days on end, and you learn each other's foibles, backstories. You learn, you're very intimate with each other. Every writer starts a story pitch by saying, this happened to me, or this is my mom's story, or this was my brother, or this is my friend, or this happened to my grandfather. And bit by bit, you learn so much about each other, and it has to be a place of great trust and value and respect and camaraderie I keep coming back to. And every room I've put together ever since, I've always tried to emulate what we had at Star Trek, and what's the role of the showrunner in that room? Ira taught me that the showrunner is first among equals, and that's a big phrase. You're not there to dominate and to tell people how it is. You're there to try to find the best idea, and somebody has to say, okay, we're going left instead of right, but you are all equals in a certain sense. My ideas are just as valuable as the lowest person on the staffing poll. The titles don't matter anymore. It's who has the best idea in the room, and that's an incredibly important idea.
And would you say that your experience on Deep Space led to Battlestar in the sense of willing to sort of break the snow globe, for lack of a better phrase? Like, I mean, the big controversy when you first came on was that you were saying, no, we're going to hit the big red reboot button. We're not going to treat canon as something that we're locked into. I mean, it's easy now in hindsight, 15 years later, to be like, well, that was obviously the right choice. But I mean, it was a pretty controversial thing at the time.
It was. And people, there was a dedicated group of original Galactica fans that were not happy about it and hated the fact. When the word got out that Starbuck was a woman, they really lost it. And there was a lot of skepticism in the fan community. I went to my first Comic-Con with the Galactica crew cast, and it was before the miniseries had been on. And we were in a very skeptical room. They were not having it. And a lot of yeah, right, and what are you doing? And you really think this is going to work, kind of thing. And then the next year, suddenly it was a room twice the size and filled with people once they had seen the show. But yeah, going in, it was definitely it was not the obvious choice that it seems like today. And a lot of that was born in Deep Space Nine, because all the limitations and frustrations I had with Star Trek, I just kind of filed away. Why can't we do it like this? Why can't we move the camera like that? Why do the characters can't do this? And there would just be this sort of list of things that were under the category of when I have my own show in the back of my head. And then lo and behold, I had a chance to do it. And I just pulled out that file and said, we're going to do all these things.
And was that, to some extent, some of the stuff that you hoped you'd be able to do on Voyager? I know you had a very brief tenure there.
Yeah, I mean, I was starting. That was an unhappy moment. There was a sense of, I thought maybe we could break boundaries and we could reinvent things and we could try to change the show fundamentally. And I walked into it with just the wrong attitude, because it was already an ongoing show and it was already successful. And I might have looked at it as not being creatively successful and that it had a lot of work to do. But that wasn't an opinion that was shared by everyone else in the production. And Brandon and I had our personal issues, and it was ultimately, I should have left. I shouldn't have done it. I should have gone out on a high note with Deep Space, but I liked Star Trek. I didn't want to leave it. It was part of who I was at that point, and I'd been my whole writing, I was there 10 years, and it was hard to leave the nest, and I was a dyed-in-the-wool fan, and who walks away from Star Trek? And at that moment, that's all I could see.
I mean, it's a little bit like graduating and sticking around your old high school afterwards, because you're like, well, I know this place.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy.
I had Richard Hatch on this show about a year before he passed away, and he told the story of himself being extremely skeptical, but sort of calming the masses and being like, listen, let's hear them out. Yeah. And I think the fact is that Tom Zarek is like one of the best roles he ever had.
Yeah, I agree.
It was so rich, and he himself said that. Like, I mean, he benefited enormously from that. And me personally, I look back on the fact that he was gone about a year after talking to me, and I think back, I'm like, I spent an hour and a half just talking to this man who. His time was running out, and I feel, humbled by that.
Yeah.
Very surreal. But no, I mean, I think the progression from Deep Space to Battlestar, to me, I see it to me, it's clear as day.
Yeah, the lineage is definitely there.
I did want to touch very briefly on First Contact, and specifically, this is a question that I've had because I wrote there was a book celebrating the entirety of Next Generation a couple of years for the 25th anniversary of the series that I contributed an essay to. I wrote about First Contact, and so this is my contention in my essay, and I want you to either disabuse me of this notion or confirm it. But my belief is that Zefram Cochrane is Gene Roddenberry in the construction of the film, where he is a man who is deeply flawed, but he has this amazing thing that he gives the world that fundamentally changes the world, and that vision is almost bigger than him, and it's about him coming to terms with that and realizing that there is the man, and then there's the thing that he creates, and sort of coming to terms with that. So by the silence, I'm assuming I'm like way out in the weeds here.
No. I'm just thinking back, and I'm realizing that is something we talked about.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was not, but it's not the origin of the character, and it's not the origin of that take on the character. We started with, what's the unexpected way to do this? To find the great man from the past that was celebrated in Metamorphosis, and Zefram Cochrane, the creative warp drive, and then you go back in history and you meet him, and it's like, holy shit, the guy's a drunk. And there was fun in that, and there was something interesting and sort of ironic about it that we were attracted to. But there was a point, I do kind of remember having that conversation with Brandon and I, kind of saying something, well, this is sort of like Gene. And we talked about it, and it was in the air. Like we had the very conversation you just, or the very argument you just laid out.
Wow.
There were certain parallels, and there was sort of a metaphoric aspect to what this was, of Gene and him realizing it was bigger than him and all that. But it wasn't the dominant influence. It was more like we had created that story and created that character, and then we kind of went, oh, and look at this. There's an interesting kind of thing going on here that we can't talk about. We can't ever say publicly, but isn't this kind of, I think we kind of were tickled by the subversive nature of it. Hey, it's kind of subversive to think of it that way. And so it was something we just kind of talked among ourselves about.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't, just completely swinging wild with that one. That actually makes me feel pretty good about the thing I wrote.
You're very sweet.
Yeah, to me, the parallel I drew is, when following the jump, the warp jump, and he's like, is that the Earth? And it looks so small, it's going to get a whole lot bigger. And that's like that moment where he realizes what he's done. And I was thinking of Gene Roddenberry looking at the Space Shuttle Enterprise and being like, this is, it's, I think what made Roddenberry a compelling and fascinating figure is exactly this, that he was a most human, and yet his legacy is this world where we all transcend that.
Yeah.
And that's amazing.
Fascinating thing.
I think that's the reason that this universe keeps plugging on. I think a lot of what you guys did on Deep Space Nine, to me, I see echoes of it on Star Trek Discovery, especially this past season of the show, where we had Anson Mount as Captain Pike, and it's tremendous. It's some of the best Star Trek I've ever seen.
Yeah, I've heard really good things about it. I keep wanting to. I feel like I've got to go back and finish one before I can dive into two. But I've heard really good stuff about it.
It's amazing to me how we're at a point now, and it's a point I never would have thought was a possibility, where we've now decoupled these characters from their original actors. Anson Mount is Captain Pike just as much as Jeffrey Hunter. Ethan Peck is just as much a Spock as we have multiple Spock actors. And I think, to me, the one thing I'll say is, and you've talked, I think it was in the First Contact commentary, where you talked about the need to decouple Star Trek from its continuity if it's going to continue. And I would argue that what we've seen now is we don't need to. I think the continuity is one of the strongest things that it has. I think the fact that you have narrative threads that connect every iteration, including the reboot films, they're all part of the.
it certainly seems like you're right. It does feel like the audience has accepted that, and it is successful. I think my concern was, and still is to a point, is there an entry gate for the new viewer? Like, if you want to start Star Trek, if you just are interested in it, can you just dive in anywhere? Was always my concern, that the continuity had grown so vast with all the series and the movies that there was so much to catch up on. Like, could you just step into the Star Trek universe as a newbie and enjoy it? And maybe the new show is proving that you can't, because I don't really know how the demographics break down and who are the fans and who's the audience of the new show. But there has to be new viewers. I doubt very much it's just dedicated Star Trek fans watching it. There must be people that are just stepping into the franchise for the first time, and it clearly seems like it's working. So maybe I'm wrong. I just didn't. It might be more analogous to comic books. Like, I guess if you want to pick up a Batman comic for the first time now, it is daunting if you feel like you got to go back, and read 50, 60 some odd years of Batman to understand it.
Right.
But maybe you can just kind of step in, and there's something joyous about knowing that there's as deep as you want to go, you can keep going. And if you want to keep checking out more Batman, hey, more power to you. But you don't really need to. Like, you can start today. You can start in whatever issue 524 is, and just go from there and still have a great time and have the comfort of knowing that if you really, really want to know more, there's more here waiting to know.
I think what you say is very apt, and it echoes something that Brandon said a couple of years ago. We were talking about Enterprise, and that show is sort of the redheaded stepchild that tends to get ignored. And one thing he said, which I agree with, is if you like Star Trek, here's 100 Star Treks that you haven't seen. Maybe you'll like some, maybe you won't, but here's 100 more of that thing that you like.
Yeah.
And what else can you say? I mean, that's this franchise to me. Is what makes it so rich is, I like some series more than others, but you know what? If I'm ever in the mood to scratch that specific itch, it's there waiting for me. Whatever flavor.
Yeah, that's all true.
But my gosh, this hour has just flown by, and I want to thank you so much for coming on and hanging out. Like I said, this is a just a childhood dream come true. So I could not have been more excited to be able to chat with you.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. You're very kind, and I enjoyed it, and happy to do it again sometime.
Well, and real quick, Outlander is continuing. I believe it's coming back for a 5th and 6th season.
Yeah, we got picked up for seasons 5 and 6. The shooting is underway right now in Scotland. Be on the air, I think, next fall sometime. I'm also working on a show called For All Mankind, which will be on Apple TV Plus, which is going to premiere sometime in the fall. And it is basically it's an alternate history of the space race. Like, what if the space race with the Soviet Union had never ended?
That sounds amazing. Sign me up.
It's pretty great.
That sounds awesome.
Wrap production. It's done. It's in the can. We're working on visual effects, and I think it's great. So yeah, I hope people enjoy it.
And do you have a social media presence in case people want to reach out and ask any questions or anything like that?
I have a fairly dormant Twitter account.
Okay.
I just don't do it anymore.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I was thinking you guys were very lucky that you didn't have social media during the Deep Space Nine days, based on all the shit that the Discovery people get.
Yeah, well, we had AOL, so we went on AOL a lot and read various comments of writers. And then there was Trek Web back in the day, would do like eviscerating reviews of episode by episode. That was as close as we got.
Fandom.
Fandom. That's why I think at this point I just kind of shrug and go, fandom. I've seen it all. Yeah. It's like, this is what they do.
That's what they do. Well, Ron Moore, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Absolutely. And I hope we'll get to chat again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. And that's it from Ron. But as for me, you can find me at my website, zakiscorner.com. That's ZAKIS Corner. That's also my Twitter. That's also my Instagram. Also, if you have any questions or comments for us at the Nostalgia Theater Show here at the Movie Film Podcast, you can email us at moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit like on our Facebook page, facebook.com/moviefilmpodcast. Also, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Leave a star rating. Every little bit helps, and it lets us know the kind of content you want us to keep producing for
for you. So that wraps up this episode of Nostalgia Theater, but I will be back soon with another foray into the recesses of ancient nostalgia. Thanks, everybody.